Hi, my name is Renaya Howard, and I'm part of Group 9, and our presentation is Social Movement. Our first slide is a mind map. I would like to elaborate on the mind map because these are 4 points that we will touch on in our presentation: media, past versus present, sociological analysis, cause and effects. Why do we need social movements? Social movements are often born out of the need to fight against social, economic, and political injustices. For instance, the Civil Rights Movement in the United States sought to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans. This movement raised awareness about systemic racism and led to significant legislative changes such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For my second point is social movements play a crucial role in shaping societies and addressing injustices. They emerge when groups of people come together to advocate for change, raise awareness, and challenge the status quo. Understanding the importance of social movements can be broken. For my last point on this slide is social movements is important because the empowerment of marginalized groups, social movements empower individuals and communities. They may feel voiceless or marginalized. By coming together, these groups can amplify their voices and demands. The women's suffrage movement, for example, organized campaigns that fought for women's right to vote, ultimately leading to the 19th Amendment in the U.S. For this picture here, I just have a marginalized voices empowerment photo showing 4 points. For my next slide is social impact. I just wrote some causes and effects that I thought were very important to include. For my first point on causes is social inequality. For my second point is economic factors, and for my third point are cultural changes, which are all three important factors, as well as environmental issues. For my next point is effects such as policy change, social awareness, community building, and political mobilization. These are also important points because they encourage political participation and engagement all around the border. For the Me Too movement page, I wanted to include important pictures to show you guys the importance of sexual harassment and assault in the women's community. So, if you didn't know, the Me Too movement is a movement that was raised and empowered by individuals to share their experience and demand accountability in the workplace and culture. These pictures here show a representation of the movement throughout the U.S. The Occupy Wall Street movement was a very important movement as well. Right here, I have 3 photos showing protest of the Wall Street movement, which emerged in 2011 and was a response to economic inequality and perceived corruption of financial institutions. Right here, you can see protesters rallied against the influence of money in politics and demanded a fair economic system. This movement brought issues of wealth disparity to the forefront of public discourse. Cultural shifts also serve as a catalyst of social movements. As societal norms evolve, they can inspire groups of mobilize for change.
Our first main point addresses the norms, dynamics, and ideas presented in social movements and how these influence future social movements. The well known quote, popularized by Thomas Bertram Lance, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," introduces the idea that there's no need to change an approach if it's already proven to work. This concept is especially relevant to social movements which often adapt established nonviolent methods like boycotting, protesting, and letter writing campaigns to drive change. In his analysis of social movement, Alden Morris argues nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. This idea was central to the civil rights movement, led by Martin Luther King, whose approach was inspired by the nonviolent philosophies of leaders like Mahatma Gandhi. These principles of peaceful resistance laid the groundwork for later movements, such as Occupy Wall Street, which then set a framework for later movements, such as Black Lives Matter. We see a pattern across social movements where Similar nonviolent tactics are applied: occupying public spaces, marching with signs, and boycotting companies that do not align with the movement's values. This continuity in strategy underscores how successful methods in past movements shape the approaches of future ones. The image of Black Lives Matter supporters holding signs in solidarity with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd reflects how modern movements utilize public protest to demand justice. By showing this image, we aim to highlight how the simple act of holding a sign symbolizes unity and calls for change. It also illustrates the endurance of peaceful resistance as a tactic, which has persisted through decades of social activism. With the rise of social media, we are also witnessing the evolution of protest methods. Social media allows movements like Black Lives Matter to share educational posts, highlight underrepresented statistics, and distribute footage that exposes injustices. These digital methods have amplified awareness of issues like police brutality, helping the movement gain widespread visibility. This poster on the left, supported by numerous student organizations, illustrates how social movements today leverage collaboration and solidarity to amplify their message. By choosing this image, we aim to convey the role of collective support in the success of movements, as it brings diverse communities together for a common cause. The display of unity among student groups reflects how younger generations continue to build on the norms and strategies of past social movements. As we observe these moments' success, we take effective elements and incorporate them into future movements. New social movements are using the successful methods from past protests and applying them in their unique contexts. For example, social media driven initiatives such as Free Palestine, the, pre, the Free Palestine movement utilizes powerful digital campaigns to raise global awareness similar to how Black Lives Matter had. Socialization is fundamental in how these methods are preserved and adapted over time. Calhoun, in Dictionary of the Social Sciences, defines socialization as the process through which individuals internalize the values, beliefs, and norms of a society. In social movements, this means the values and nonviolent tactics become embedded within the collective identity, reinforcing behaviors and strategies proven to be effective. As new generations join these movements, they inherit socialized practices from previous activists. This image of the Occupy Wall Street protests demonstrates how nonviolent methods like signage and peaceful occupation are used to express dissent and demand change. This visual is impactful because it shows how these tactics continue to be relevant in modern day movements, underscoring the continuity of strategies across social movements. By showing this, we emphasize the point that tactics that work are preserved and used again by subsequent movements. Through these examples, we hope to illustrate that socialization is crucial for passing down effective methods and maintaining the continuity of social activism. Successful movements create a roadmap for future movements, which adopt and adapt proven strategies to tackle new challenges.
My name is Carson Miller, and for the next part of the presentation, I will be talking about two extremely impactful social movements that, when compared, are perfect examples of how many social theories come into play. The topic is past versus present social movements. My main point will focus on an example of past versus present social movements and how many aspects of sociology tie into their effect during and after both movements. The two social movements I will focus on are civil rights movement 1950s through 1960s and the Black Lives Matter movement from 2013 on to the present. Both these movements concern racial inequality, the right for fair justice, and freedom for Black people in America. For this portion of the project, I'd like to highlight the media's effect on social movement over time. While our country is constantly trying to make every race and ethnicity equally respected and represented, the rapid growth of social media, media services, and news outlets continues to bring new perspectives and increased media coverage. As you can see, these are two examples of what media looked like for both of the movements. Here there's a march with a strong message saying, "I'm a man," and here is a news article saying 4 Negroes beaten at Klan rally, which was a peaceful rally, and they were beat by the police, which made front page news, along with a very impactful picture here of people marching outside of the White House, and then moving on to how social media has affected the Black Lives Matter movement and how it looked a lot different now than it did back then. While exploring the similarities and differences between the two movements mentioned above, I will incorporate 3 different sociological theories explaining how both movements were affected in their respective periods. I'll explore the following theories: cultural lag, the time gap between the appearance of a new technology and the words and practices that give its meaning. So things like this, where you can see in this picture on the far left how old time technology is now changing into new technology, and that's giving us new perspectives on the world. I'll move on to ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own culture or group is superior to others, and the tendency to view all other cultures from the perspective of one's own. So ethnocentrism is perfectly displayed in this visual here with the words white privilege up in bold, and then around it a bunch of things that come with the stereotype of white privilege and how we have racism and prejudice and discrimination all out throughout our country. And that was created through the civil rights movement and very popular in the Black Lives Matter movement. Finally, I'll talk about counterculture, which is a large cultural group defined in the opposition to the ideologies, values, and norms of the mainstream culture. This is pretty self-explanatory. These were all the people who really fought hard for their values and went against the mainstream norms of being okay with racism and discrimination and chose to do something about it. Moving on to media specifically. During the civil rights movement, activists employed nonviolent direct action tactics such as sit-ins, boycotts, freedom rides, marches, and rallies to draw attention to racial segregation and discrimination. These peaceful demonstrations publicly challenged unjust laws and practices, leveraging media coverage to gain widespread public support. As you can see, this is what a sit-in, a freedom ride, and a march would look like from the civil rights movement. Very impactful, and this was their way of getting media out. This was their way of protesting for civil rights. And moving on to the Black Lives Matter, protesting looked a little different in the 2010s through on. Everyone had access to social media and the internet, meaning protest to demographics right here. This is the hashtag Black Lives Matter on Twitter, and just to show how many people are posting on social media and what it all means, 1.2 million on the day that George Floyd was killed. Things went down from there, but still super prevalent hashtag. And then this is moving on to a perspective on how the hashtag Black Lives Matter and how people use their phone can actually be a little bit of a downfall to a social movement. Only 72% of people using the hashtag and putting their opinions out online for people to read were supportive, while 17% being neutral and 11%, which is a large amount, opposing the matter and making a mockery of it, which was super impactful and a lot different than how people treated the media during the civil rights movement. Finally, I'll discuss the 3 sociological theories and how both movements were affected based on the theories. First, cultural lag. During the civil rights, while legal and constitutional changes aimed to dismantle segregation, as a result, societal attitudes lagged, leading to continued resistance to integration. So what's that saying is once the Civil Rights Act was enacted, it was legally a very big thing, and Black people were legally treated as, or were supposed to be treated as fair as white people, but the cultural lag there was society not accepting that bill yet in their lives. And for the Black Lives Matter movement, had heightened awareness of systematic racism. Many social structures like police and criminal justice, though, lagged behind in implementing their reforms. So things were in place for Black people to be free and have their own opinions and cultures, while the police and criminal justice system was the cultural lag behind that, and they were still being systematically racist. Moving on to ethnocentrism. In the civil rights, many white Americans and institutions viewed their cultural norms and privileges as superior, justifying segregation and systematic racism. Pretty self-explanatory through this image. A white waiting room for colored only is a direct example of how ethnocentrism was used. It was the white people actively thinking they're better and doing tactics to separate cultures. While during the Black Lives Matter, some critics of the movement emphasized the idea of law and order in efforts to dismiss systematic racism and view police authority as a superior cultural value. So a lot of the people who would go against the Black Lives Matter movement, their argument was that the police were doing what they had to do, and they were justifying the fact that police brutality is good, which is another example of ethnocentrism, because it's bad. And the police culture was a very huge driving factor in that. Moving on to my last point, counterculture. In the civil rights, the movement itself represented a counterculture, changing societal norms that didn't accept racism and demanded equality, freedom, and justice. Civil rights movement was such a big culture movement in general. It itself is fully around counterculture and how Black activists and Black people around all of America were able to rise up for their freedom. And for Black Lives Matter, represents a counterculture by opposing systematic racism, advocating for police reform, and challenging the broader social structures that still have inequality. Black Lives Matter stemmed to many other races, bringing light to their discrimination, and the overall drive to end systematic racism was the biggest fact of the counterculture during Black Lives Matter. Thank you for listening.
The feminist movement has long fought for gender equality and fighting against patriarchy, and the feminist movement has been trying to tackle issues ranging from reproductive rights to violence against women. So in this photo right here, you can see that there is the Women Liberation Movement photo from the 1970s, and here they're fighting for equal education and job opportunities. So next slide. So there are two different types of feminism. There's liberal and radical feminism. So liberal feminism is more focused on trying to change what goes on systemically in terms of gender inequalities. And radical feminist is more than just a systemic thing that they're trying to dismantle. They're trying to dismantle the entire structure of patriarchy. So in the photo I have here of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she's one of the notable feminists in our history. She was one of the first women to work at Columbia Law School, and she wasn't getting paid the same amount as her other male coworkers, and she took it to court herself. So the next topic about feminism that's really important is intersectionality. So intersectionality highlights the ways in which many social identities, including sexual orientation, class, and race, interact to give women of color distinct experiences of oppression. So here's Kimberly Crenshaw, and she's the one who basically started talking about this whole idea of intersectionality, and it's really important because race and different backgrounds play a huge role when it comes to gender inequalities, because obviously women of color are going to be more discriminated against in comparison to like women who are not women of color. So the next topic is the social construction of gender. So Judith Butler is one person who is an example of a feminist with social constructionist views, and they believe that gender is not a biological requirement, but rather a learned social role. So a resistance strategy of feminism that's very common is called consciousness rating. So it's a grassroots approach where women gather to talk about their individual experiences of oppression. So this is a really good time for women to come together and just be vulnerable and talk about their own experiences in ways that they've experienced, like discrimination for being a woman or just inequalities that they've faced. and it's really important to confront structural injustices. So this was very important to how feminism has evolved today, and is also important to how movements occurred, like the women's liberation movement. So feminism is really important in terms of activism and theory and discussion. So by incorporating all these concepts, we can combat structural oppression that is still in our society today, systemically. And if we work together.
Hi, my name is Namil Abbey, and today I'll be talking about how social movements have been stopped in the past. Social movements seeking justice and equality have faced significant challenges throughout history. Many have been stopped due to a combination of internal and external factors. Internally, movements may not falter due to lack of organization, leadership conflicts, or insufficient resources. Externally, movements are often disrupted by coordinated efforts to delegitimize their causes, infiltrate their ranks, or use brute forces. For instance, the labor movements of the early 20th century were often broken by strikebreakers hired by corporations, alongside police crackdowns. Similarly, civil rights organizations faced violent attacks and legal challenges that sapped their momentum. Even when movements managed to survive, the opposition's tactics often forced them to compromise their original goals, delaying progress for years or even decades. In this slide, I chose to put pictures of police brutality. This picture is actually recent. It was in 2020 when there were the Black Lives Matter protests. This picture on the bottom as well is recent. I like this picture because it shows the cops circled around the protesters, and it kind of showed, in my opinion, the amount of effort that the protesters could do, because there's not much you can do when the government is trying to stop it. And then the picture I like the most was the one I used right here. This was a picture from the 1900s. It was just a peaceful protest for civil rights, and that was why I chose that picture. In slide two, I talked about how government strategies to suppress social movements. As I talked about, governments were suppressing social movements, but they had certain strategies for that. One of them was surveillance. Authorities closely monitored activists, often collecting evidence to justify arrests or discredit leaders. Programs like COINTELPRO in the United States targeted civil rights and anti-war activists. Another example is legislation. Laws are passed to limit protest activities, restrict public gatherings, or impose harsh penalties for civil disobedience. Media control. Governments manipulate public opinion by framing activists as dangerous or unpatriotic. This can involve controlling state media or influencing private outlets to push certain narratives. This one, in my opinion, is the biggest one today, as the internet is the most powerful way to spread information. And we've seen it countless times. People misspreading information, and it's altering how people vote, how people see movements and their opinions. Lastly, violence and intimidation. From police brutality to arrest and imprisonment, governments use fear to deter participation. In some cases, they deploy military forces against their own citizens, as seen in the Tiananmen Square protests. And again, here's some pictures. This one's from the Japanese internment camp, actually. And I just wanted to put this in because I think it's not talked enough of what they did during World War II. And then this one was in court, and I thought this was important too, because a lot of big activists and big movements have oftentimes gone to court. And then, this picture on the bottom, I also like. In this slide, I talked about the historical suppression of movements. Throughout history, powerful forces have sought to suppress social movements to maintain control and preserve the status quo. A clear example is the early labor movement in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Workers fighting for fair wages and safe working conditions were met with violent crackdowns. Strikes like the Pullman Strike of 1894 ended in bloodshed, as government forces and private militias were used to suppress organizing efforts. Similarly, the civil rights movements faced not only social resistance but also systemic repression. Leaders like MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., were targeted by government surveillance programs like COINTELPRO, as I was talking about in slide one, which aimed to discredit and disrupt their work. Activists were jailed and peaceful protests were met with brutal violence, seen as events like the 1965 summer marches. These examples show that suppression was often carried out through a combination of force, legislation, and public manipulation, with the intent of the delegitimization movements and deterring participation. Historical suppression demonstrates how power structures will go to great lengths to silence dissent, often in ways that shape the political and social landscapes for decades. And I chose these pictures, this one especially, because I thought it was a very interesting picture. So you can see it was military police, and oftentimes when there are protests or movements, they'll actually get the military to come to help the police. Because honestly, the most powerful thing you can have in a society are people working together. That's the most fearful thing that government can have. And this picture right here, I thought was just a very nice picture. This picture of the Black Panther Party, and I just like that picture. In this slide, I talked about the contemporary suppression tactics, and specifically, I wanted to focus on McCarthyism. Many of today's suppression tactics bear striking similarities to those used during the McCarthy era in the 1950s. Under Senator Joseph, McCarthy's anti-communism crusade, individuals suspected of harboring leftist sympathies were accused, blacklisted, and publicly shamed. The government used fear once again of communism to justify silencing activists, artists, and intellectuals. Careers were destroyed, dissent was stifled, and the phrase un-American activities became a tool to discredit any movement for change. And you still hear these phrases to this day. On the internet, people talk almost every day. Fast forward to today, and the tactics of suppression have evolved with technology and modern rhetoric. Governments now use advanced surveillance systems, such as facial recognition software and social media monitoring, to track activists. Protesters are labeled as domestic terrorists or extremists to delegitimize their causes, similar to how McCarthyism branded dissenters as communists. Legislation has also become a key tool. Laws restricting protests under the pretense of public safety impose severe penalties on peaceful demonstrations. Media manipulation remains prevalent, with narratives framing activists as dangerous or disruptive, undermining their legitimacy in the eyes of the public. The echoes of McCarthyism remind us that suppression tactics adapt to the times, but the goal remains the same: to maintain power and control by silencing those who challenge the status quo. Recognizing these patterns is essential for resisting contemporary suppression and preserving the right to dissent. And these pictures were it was just very simple. It was just a picture of McCarthy. And then I was reading this article, and I chose to put this picture. It's very interesting. And this was probably the most interesting slide, as it was something so long ago. But yet today, as I was reading it, I thought of a bunch of examples of people using the term un-American or communism when anyone has any ideas, basically, that are outside the box. They're immediately shot down. And these terms